Is it impossible to both control all things and know all things? According to many atheists, the answer is yes, as they argue that the Christian doctrine of God's omnipotence, his sovereign control and ability to do all things according to his will, is inconsistent with, logically cannot coexist with the Christian doctrine of God's omniscience, that is, his knowing all things, including the future. Many atheists argue that you simply can't have both, that logically they don't fit together. As Richard Dawkins wrote in The God Delusion, chapter 3, he argues that it has not escaped the notice of logicians that omniscience and omnipotence are mutually incompatible. If God is omniscient, he must already know how he is going to intervene to change the course of history using his omnipotence. But that means he can't change his mind about his intervention, which means he is not omnipotent. So in other words, if God can do anything, then that should include doing things that he omnisciently knows he's not going to do. It seems like, if this is solid reasoning, that the omniscience of God and the omnipotence of God are logically incompatible, and therefore the Christian picture of God is inconsistent, is absurd. Well, there's a couple of answers we can give to arguments like this. The first thing we should note is that any time that you're making an argument based on our understanding of God's attributes, you're on rather dubious ground. Now, this doesn't require that I ask the atheist to assume that God actually exists, but both an atheist and a Christian would agree that the idea of God is an idea of a God or of a being, which is supernatural, which is beyond our full comprehension. Imagine an ant trying to grasp what it means for a person to fall in love. Or imagine a bacteria trying to imagine what it's like for a bird to fly. The nature of a thing may restrict its ability to understand fully the experience or qualities of a higher order being. And what is higher order than God? When human beings try to say, well, if I was omnipotent, this is how it would work, or, this is how omniscience would be. Are you sure? Are you sure? I mean, we can say the words. Omnipotence means being all-powerful. Omniscience means knowing all things. But can you really wrap your mind around what that would be? How that would work? And if we can't really grasp what it would be like to have those qualities, what the experience of them would be, then we're just on shaky ground when it comes to trying to say, well, this would work just like this, and therefore it appears incompatible with this other thing. It's just a dubious argument to begin with. But what's particularly odd about this specific argument is that actually, insofar as we can understand these attributes, they don't actually seem inconsistent. In fact, there's nothing about our understanding of omnipotence and omniscience which would actually suggest that they need to be logically opposed. Let's just back up a little bit and think through why that would be. So, omnipotence says that God can do all things. The Bible makes that quite clear. So God can do all things. And then omniscience says that God knows all things, including the future. But let's back up on that latter point about omniscience, knowing all things. Let's back up a moment and think about what it means to know something. So suppose I wave at the camera. You know that I just waved at the camera. Why do you know that? Because a little chain of cause and effect took place. First, in my mind, I reached a decision about what I would do. Then I did that thing on the basis of my decision. You then observed that thing that I did, and it became knowledge for you. Your knowledge was determined by my choice that then resulted in my action. So we start with the thing that happens, and then it becomes knowledge of that thing. That is simply how knowledge works. If you have knowledge of something, it starts with the thing that you're knowing. And insofar then as we can actually wrap our mind around what it would be like to know the future, that omniscient knowledge of the future would be determined by the future. You can't know the future unless there's a future to be known. So whatever omniscience, however it would work, it's essentially knowing what will be in the future. In other words, God, 1,000 years ago, if he had cared, he did know that I was going to wave at the camera a few minutes ago. He knew that because I did it. If I had not decided to do it, he couldn't, notice that word, he couldn't have known it because it was not there to be known. There was no wave to be known unless I waved. So God's omniscient knowledge of the future is determined by the future events themselves, which he is knowing. Now, why is that significant? Well, that goes to this attempted paradox of what if God, changed his mind and did something in the future that he didn't foreknow? Well, ultimately, whatever God actually does in the future is what he's going to foreknow in the past, that he's going to do it. And if he changes his mind at, moment A, and therefore does something different at moment B, then that is what he would have foreknown in the distant past that he was going to do, because that's what he did. And that's how foreknowledge, omniscient knowledge of the future works. So trying to insert God changing his mind somewhere in there, and somehow he changes his mind to something he didn't foreknow, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Because the foreknowledge is simply essentially a looking at what God or anybody else would actually do in the future. And therefore, whatever they actually do is what God foreknows, and there's no possibility of some sort of weird conflict between what he wants to do or tries to do and what he foreknew that he was going to. He's going to foreknow whatever he or anyone else does, because that's what foreknowledge is. And therefore, there's no conflict whatsoever between omnipotence and omniscience, even insofar as we're able to understand them.